Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Caspian Rook. In this city, I'm the guy who shows up at dawn with a tape measure clipped to his belt and a truck bed rattling with tools. I run a small contracting outfit, mostly handling repairs and remodels. The unglamorous work that keeps you booked solid because buildings are always leaking, cracking, or threatening to fall apart. Linnea and I got married not long ago, and we settled downtown in a tight apartment perched right above the noise. Down there, traffic never actually stops, and the air always carries that faint metallic scent of wet pavement and exhaust. That fall, the rain just wouldn't quit. It was relentless. It drummed against scaffolding, waterlogged my job site lumber, and turned every alleyway into a rushing brown stream. Canvas jackets stayed damp and work boots never fully dried out overnight. You could feel the cold seeping into your bones even when the thermometer claimed it was mild, because water doesn't care about the numbers. Outside the city limits, we owned a small weekend place off a quiet rural road. It was more of a simple cottage than a real home, just a place to park for a night. But above that property, hidden partway up the mountain, sat my actual escape. A log cabin I'd been carving into the slope over the last couple of seasons. The logs were thick enough to shoulder the weight of the soil on the roof, and the back wall rested directly against solid rock. But the interior was still bare bones. It had a small bed for the two of us, a narrow table, and plenty of unfinished rough spots I kept meaning to seal up. Linnea used to look at the rainy forecast, then look at me with that knowing expression and say, "You know that cabin could actually keep us dry if you just finish it." I'd give her a tired smile, wiping drywall dust off my hands, and answer, "Soon, babe." Just as soon as work slows down. Then we'd both laugh, because in this trade, work never slows down. Back then, it was just a private spot to reset our heads. A few days later, it became the only place on earth that made sense to run to and hide quietly. The job that morning was a small addition on a medical office building sharing a sprawling lot with St. Bridget's Hospital, and the rain had been relentless for days. Tarps sagged, plywood swelled, and every step off the gravel pulled boots into inches of mud. It was a miserable slog. Cut, fit, fasten, keep the material covered, and keep the crew moving so nobody stood around getting cold. Marco pointed at a bundle of lumber and said, "This stack is going to warp if it sits out here." "Get it under the framed wall and keep plastic over it," I answered, and he nodded and moved to get it done. Across the lot, the hospital entrance doors kept sliding open and shut, visitors moving fast with umbrellas and heads down. Then a shout cut through the rain, sharp and wrong for that place. The doors hissed open again, and a man in a thin hospital gown stumbled out like he had forgotten how to walk. Mid-30s maybe. Barefoot, skin too pale under the gray sky. He moved in short jerks, shoulders tight, hands fluttering near his mouth like he was wiping something off his lips. A woman in scrubs followed him, skidding on the wet concrete, one hand out like she was guiding him, and she yelled something I couldn't hear. He didn't slow down. He made a straight line for a security guard, stepping forward with palms out. The guard took a half step back and said, "Sir, you need to come back inside." The gown man didn't answer. He lunged, grabbed the guard's jacket with both hands, and bit into the side of his neck. The guard made a sound that didn't register as a word. The nurse screamed, "Call it in!" and slipped backward. For a second, everybody in the lot froze, because brains want a label and there wasn't one. That wasn't a fight. It was a bite, hard and committed. Two cops appeared at the entrance, one on his radio and the other already drawing his pistol. The armed one shouted, "Oh, get off him!" And when nothing changed, he fired twice, fast and controlled. The shots cracked across the lot. The guard dropped to his knees, hands clamped to his neck. The man in the gown took the bullets like they were punches. He rocked back, then forward again, reaching for the guard like he wanted to keep going. The cop fired again. A dark spot spread on the gown man's chest, but there was no collapse, no stumble, no normal reaction. His head snapped toward the sound, mouth open, teeth red. Marco whispered, "What the hell is that?" The second cop stepped closer and fired again. and it still didn't put the guy down. A nurse dragged the injured guard away by his belt, slipping once, and the gown man turned toward her like he had switched targets. That was the moment it clicked. People get shot and they fall. Even if they're high, even if they're furious, bodies still obey damage. This body wasn't obeying anything except the drive to grab and bite, and the cops were already moving the way men move when they realize their usual tools aren't working. No alert had hit my phone. No news banner was running anywhere. It was just rain, gunshots, and a man who should have been on the ground, still moving. Tessa, my foreman, stared across the lot and said, "Is this a patient escape?" "No," I answered him, "this is something else." The simple list ran through my head without drama. Linnea was downtown in a building with one stairwell and a slow elevator. Streets around us were already tight. If this was contagious and it looked like it spread through bites, then the hospital was the last place to stand around waiting for someone to explain it. A regular emergency gets loud and organized. This felt like the opposite, quiet at the edges and ugly in the middle. I raised my voice toward my crew and said, "Shut it down. Pack what you can carry. We're leaving right now." Marco blinked and asked, "Leaving where?" "Home," I said. "Wherever home is, go there and lock your door." Tessa grabbed her phone and said, "Should I call the office?" "Call your family," I answered, and she nodded like she understood the difference. Tools went into bags fast. Cords got yanked. We chained the heavy generator to the fence and left it. There was no time to haul dead weight. It wasn't tidy, but it was quick. My eyes kept drifting back to the entrance. The cops were still firing, and the man in the gown was still up, swaying, reaching, trying to close distance like he couldn't feel pain. People were running now, slipping in the wet, shouting warnings nobody could process. Truck keys were already in my hand. The moment the driver door shut, my thumb hit Linnea's number. Waiting for official instructions felt like standing still while the problem spread. The line rang once, then twice. As I pulled out, a siren started in town, faint at first and then louder, and the hospital doors slammed shut behind the glass like someone decided it was too late to keep pretending. That was my warning, and it was early. Traffic downtown was already on edge. It wasn't total gridlock yet, but it was twitchy, like the whole city sensed something was wrong but didn't have a name for it. The rain made the asphalt glossy, reflecting brake lights that stretched into long, bleeding red smears at every intersection. Linnea picked up on the third ring, her voice distracted. "Hey, you calling from the site?" I kept my eyes scanning the mirrors and answered, "Listen to me carefully. Leave whatever you're doing and go straight home right now." She paused a beat, the background noise on her end falling away, then asked, "What happened? Are you okay?" "Something bad happened at the hospital," I said, cutting to the chase. "It's not a rumor, Linnea. I saw it happen." Another pause, shorter this time, and she said, "Okay, I'm moving." She was close enough to walk home faster than she could drive in this weather, so that became the plan. I kept the phone on speaker on the passenger seat while the windshield wipers slapped back and forth, fighting the downpour. "Don't stop to help anyone," I told her, my voice tight. "If someone acts confused or aggressive, cross the street and keep going. Don't engage." Linnea answered, "Got it," and the line went dead. Parking downtown was a headache on a normal day, but that afternoon it was a mess. A delivery van was double parked, blocking half a lane with its hazards flashing, the driver screaming into his phone and waving his free arm. Sirens were starting to layer in from different directions, creating a disorienting wall of sound, and somewhere close by, a car horn just stayed pressed down, a steady, angry blare. I finally wedged the truck into a narrow loading zone 2 blocks from our building. Rain hit the brim of my cap the second I opened the door. In the lobby, a few residents stood near the mailboxes, all staring at their phones like zombies, waiting for a push notification to explain the sirens outside. Upstairs, the apartment felt terrifyingly quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice the hum of the refrigerator. Packing started fast and stayed simple. We didn't have time for sentiment. Kitchen cupboards got emptied into 2 heavy-duty plastic totes. Cans, rice, pasta, peanut butter, salt, coffee, anything that could survive without a fridge. Linnea always kept extra staples because she hated running out of things, and that habit suddenly felt like a lifeline. She came through the door about 15 minutes later, hair plastered to her forehead, cheeks flushed red from moving hard through the cold rain. She threw the deadbolt, dropped her bag, and said, "Tell me exactly what you saw." Her words were steady, but her hands shook when she pushed wet hair behind her ear. "A patient bit a guard," I said, looking her in the eyes. "The cops shot him multiple times, and it didn't stop him. He just kept coming." Linnea stared at me, then at the rain-streaked window, then back. "So we're leaving," she said. "Yeah," I answered. "We go before this turns into a crowd and the roads close." There were no speeches. The apartment turned into a packing line. Linnea filled a large duffel with rain gear, wool socks, gloves, and thermal layers, then added a box of trash bags and rolls of duct tape because wet weather turned small problems into disasters. I stripped the bathroom cabinet next. Bars of soap, sanitizer, wet wipes, and every roll of toilet paper we had. Tools mattered because the mountain cabin wasn't finished. The heavy equipment stayed, but the essentials went into the bag. A cordless drill with 2 charged batteries, a box of deck screws, a hammer, a pry bar, a handsaw, plastic sheeting, and a staple gun. A headlamp and spare batteries went into the top pocket where I could reach them in the dark. Water came next. I grabbed the 2 5-gallon jerry cans from the utility closet, plus every loose bottle we had. Linnea topped off 1 more container at the sink and said, "Even if we filter up there, having clean water right away buys us time." Her tone stayed practical, strictly business, and that helped keep the panic out of the room. On the living room floor, a pile formed. Food, water, a basic first aid kit, sleeping bags, tarps, and a road atlas because cell signals disappear fast outside the city limits. A small crank radio went in too, along with a solar battery pack and cables. None of it was fancy survivalist gear. It was just stuff that worked without a wall outlet. Firearms were the part nobody likes handling in a thin-walled apartment building, but pretending we lived in a normal world felt stupid now. The handgun went into a locked travel case with 2 loaded magazines. The shotgun came out next, unloaded, action open, followed by a box of shells. Linnea watched quietly, then asked, "Do you really think we'll need that?" "I think we need options," I said, and snapped the case shut. The crossbow came off the top shelf of the hall closet, dusty from last season. It was quiet, and it could put food on the table later without a gunshot rolling down a valley and announcing our position. A small quiver of bolts went into the same case, and Linnea nodded like she understood the logic without me explaining it. Keys went onto 1 ring. Cash went into my wallet. We shut the apartment down like we were leaving for a long vacation. Curtains drawn, lights off, nothing left out that could shine or beep. As the last tote snapped shut, my phone buzzed with the first official emergency alert, a jarring tone followed by a short, vague message telling people to shelter in place and avoid the hospital district. Linnea read it over my shoulder and said, "We're already late." In the hallway, footsteps and muffled voices started building. A neighbor knocked once, soft at first, then harder. Linnea kept her voice low and asked, "Do we answer?" "No," I said, holding up a hand. Opening the door invites questions, and questions invite delays we couldn't afford. The knocking stopped, and someone down the hall started arguing loudly about whether the news was fake. The stairwell was faster than the elevator. Bags thumped against my legs on the way down, and the building felt different, less like a home and more like a trap people were about to get stuck inside. At street level, the rain had turned heavier, and the sirens were louder now. Closer, mixed with shouting somewhere around the corner. The truck bed swallowed the totes and duffels. Linnea climbed into the passenger seat, pulled the door shut, and said, "Go." One look at the street told the story. Cars were wedged in intersections, people were walking fast with their heads on a swivel, and a line was already forming outside the corner store like everyone had decided at the same exact moment that supplies mattered. I threw the wipers to high and clicked the turn signal. Getting out of downtown was going to be the next fight, and the window for a clean exit was already slamming shut. The rain had turned the city into a distorted dark mirror, and every red light felt like a trap waiting to spring. Cars were stacked tight for 3 blocks, red taillights bleeding into the wet asphalt, and drivers were laying on their horns like noise alone could clear the gridlock. A city bus sat crooked in the center lane with its hazards flashing, passengers spilling out into the downpour to walk. Linnea kept her seatbelt on, hands folded tight in her lap, eyes scanning the sidewalks. "Tell me the plan again," she said, her voice calm but her eyes darting between the pedestrians and the jammed cars. "Where are we going first?" "The cottage off the county road," I answered, eyes checking the mirrors. "We stage there, then hike up to the mountain cabin." She nodded once, tight and sharp. "Okay. Just keep us out of the crowds." A police cruiser was blocking the next intersection, light bar strobing blue and red off the wet brick buildings. Officers were frantically waving traffic away from the hospital district, and half the drivers were trying to pull U-turns at the same time. The main route to the freeway on-ramp was already a choke point, so I eased the truck onto the narrower surface streets, keeping it slow and steady, putting distance between us and the sirens. Cell service was still active, but it was spotty. A video clip loaded in jagged, buffering chunks, showing a mob pressed against glass hospital doors while security guards swung batons to hold them back. Another clip showed someone sprinting through a hotel lobby while a fire alarm wailed. Linnea glanced at the screen and said, "That looks like a movie." "Yeah," I answered, tightening my grip on the wheel. "And I hate that we're in it." The rain actually helped in one way. Fewer people were loitering outside, and the heavy, wet air kept the screaming from carrying too far. The downside was traction. Every turn felt slick, and deep puddles hid potholes that could blow a tire. A flat in this environment would be a full stop, and full stops turn into fatalities fast. Pedestrians surged off curbs without waiting for walk signs, hoods up, weaving between bumpers. One guy slapped my hood and shouted something unintelligible before disappearing into the pack. Linnea watched him in the side mirror and said, "Everybody's acting like the rules don't count anymore." "They don't," I said. "Not when people get this scared." We hit the edge of downtown where the skyline dropped and the streets widened. A desperate line had already formed outside a gas station. Cars angled aggressively, engines idling, people staring at the pumps like they were the last water source in a desert. Pulling in was a gamble, but running dry later would be a death sentence. Cash came out first because card readers are the first thing to fail when networks get overloaded. At the pump, a woman yelled at no one in particular, "They're saying stay home," and a man in a yellow raincoat yelled back, "Home is right where this started." Linnea stayed in the cab with the doors locked, head on a swivel. I filled the truck's tank, then filled the 2 jerry cans in the bed, quick and clean. A guy standing behind the next car stepped into my personal space, eyes locked on the red cans. "You selling any of that?" he asked. "No," I answered flatly, stepping so my body blocked his path to the nozzle. He read the room, saw the look in my eye, and backed away. A siren screamed past the station, pushing the crowd's anxiety into overdrive. People started cutting lines. Someone shouted a threat. I screwed the caps on tight, didn't wait for a receipt, and got the truck rolling. The freeway ramps were completely shut down by concrete barriers and cruisers. Drivers were abandoning cars on the shoulders to argue with officers who already looked exhausted. One cop just waved me away without even making eye contact. Back roads were the only option left. We cut through older residential neighborhoods where porch lights were burning at 2 in the afternoon. A homeowner stood under his awning gripping a baseball bat, staring at the street like he was waiting for a war. A few blocks later, an ambulance sat crooked at a stop sign, both front doors hanging open, nobody inside. Linnea leaned forward against the dash. "That's not normal," she whispered. "No," I said, and kept my foot on the gas. Near a strip mall, movement flashed in the rain. A woman sprinted across the parking lot wearing only one shoe, screaming for help. Behind her, a man in a gray hoodie moved faster than made sense on slick pavement, arms reaching, head low, predatory. He tackled her at the curb and she went down hard. He bent over her, and the mechanics of the movement were wrong. Too close, too focused. Linnea's hand flew to her mouth. "Don't look," I said, and turned the wheel hard before we had to pass them. The street grid finally broke into feeder roads lined with trees and small warehouses. Traffic thinned out, but it didn't feel safer. Every car that passed felt like a threat assessment, and every person walking on the shoulder looked like a potential trap. The rain made it harder to read faces, and faces are the only way to tell if someone is sick, desperate, or just trying to get home. A text came in from Linnea's sister, 3 simple words. "Are you safe?" Linnea typed back. "Leaving town. Stay inside. Lock up." She stared at the screen a second longer than she needed to, then put the phone face down. Out past the last big intersections, the land finally opened up into fields and low hills. The sky stayed the same oppressive gray, and the rain kept coming in sheets. Tires hissed on wet asphalt, and the truck cab smelled like damp canvas and adrenaline. A green road sign for the county route appeared, and a narrower blacktop road branched off under the trees. Linnea let out a long breath and said, "This feels better." "It will," I answered, "as long as we don't meet anyone who had the exact same idea." The last glance in the rearview showed a smear of flashing blue lights under the storm clouds, and then the trees closed in and the city noise fell away. The hard part wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The county road leading to our cottage was usually dead quiet, just wet asphalt, towering pines, and the smell of ozone and dirt after a storm. But that afternoon it was carrying way too much traffic. Pickups and sedans were moving too fast on the straights and braking hard in the blind curves, every driver locked in on the same goal: get somewhere remote before the city spilled its problems out here. The cottage sat back behind some bare maples and tall scrub grass, plain vinyl siding, a small porch, and a gravel turnaround that captured every tire mark like a fingerprint. With the rain hitting sideways, the place looked thin and exposed, fine for a weekend getaway, but not built to withstand a siege of desperate strangers. Linnea stepped in behind me, shaking water off her sleeves, and said, "We unload fast. We don't make this a home." Then she glanced back toward the road like she expected a car to pull in any second. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of old pine wood and damp insulation. We didn't settle in. We turned the kitchen into a staging area. Tote lids popped open and we started triage. Cans and dry food on the table, water jugs near the door. We laid a towel down for muddy boots, but the boots stayed on. Taking them off felt too much like staying. Linnea watched the window for a beat and asked, "If someone knocks, we don't answer, right?" "Right," I answered, sorting gear. "We don't do conversation through a door when we're trying to disappear." No fire in the wood stove, no candles, and no loud voices because sound carries for miles in this damp air. I cranked the radio next because information was worth more than comfort. Most stations were dead static, but one local signal pushed through in broken bursts, a tired, canned voice repeating instructions about road closures, designated shelters, and avoiding contact with anyone acting erratic or violent. Linnea listened with her head tilted, then said, "They're choosing their words carefully, like they're terrified of causing a panic." "That means it's already worse than they want to admit," I said. Another alert buzzed on our phones, longer this time, still vague, still telling people to stay calm and stay inside. The cottage held the heavy, boring supplies the apartment never could. Dry firewood stacked under the eaves, a small propane camp stove with spare canisters, extra tarps, and a heavy plastic bin of hardware I kept for projects. That bin was gold now. Screws, nails, hinges, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, and a staple gun. It was the simple stuff that turns an unfinished cabin into a sealed bunker. But we had a weight problem. The mountain cabin was the real destination, sitting way above the property line on a steep deer trail that turned into a creek whenever it rained. It was built into the slope, hidden from the road, with thick logs and a roof buried under soil, strong enough to hold earth but still unfinished inside. We couldn't haul everything in one trip. The heavy generator we'd chained up at the job site, forget it. Even the big water jugs were too much for the first run. Linnea handed me the lighter items and said, "Take the plastic and the duct tape. Rain finds every crack up there." She was right. Wet air turns small drafts into hypothermia. "We take the essentials now," I said, leaving the bulk of the food and the heavy tools for a second trip we might not even get to make. If we can't carry it, we don't own it. A look outside confirmed the risk. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud near our road turnoff, not ours. They were angled like someone had slowed down to check the place out and then decided to keep moving. Linnea crouched, touched the edge of a track with 2 fingers and said, "That's recent." She stood up, wiping her hand. "They're already scouting." Headlights appeared down the road through the rain and a pickup rolled past without stopping, but it proved the point. This road was already on people's maps. We didn't want our cottage to become a question mark they came back to answer. There was no sentimental packing. A final sweep grabbed salt, a manual can opener, paper towels, a jug of bleach, candles, and an extra lighter. Linnea paused at a framed photo of us on the shelf, held it for a split second, then set it back down face up. "We can't carry memories right now," she said, and the way she said it made the room feel suddenly smaller. We locked the door behind us, leaving the truck parked and silent. The plan was simple. The cottage was just a supply depot. The mountain was where we went off the radar. The trail to the mountain cabin started behind the cottage's woodshed and immediately climbed into dense timber. The rain had carved deep, slick grooves down the center of the path, and every exposed root was as slippery as greased pipe. Every step demanded focus. We left the truck parked at the cottage because it couldn't handle this grade in the mud, which meant anything vital had to go on our backs. Linnea cinched the straps of her pack tight, checked her footing, and said, "If one of us slips and breaks an ankle up here, nobody is coming to help." She glanced up the dark, rain-soaked slope and added, "So we move slow. We don't get brave and we don't rush." I fished a length of safety rope out of my bag and we tied it between our waist belts. Not to drag each other, but to keep one person from sliding off the trail if the ground gave out. "Keep your hands on the branches and watch your balance," I said. We started up, ducking under low hemlock limbs that dumped freezing water down our collars every time the wind shifted. Halfway up, the cottage roof vanished behind the tree line and the road noise faded completely. The only sounds left were the drumming of rain on leaves and the wet suction of boots pulling out of mud. Linnea kept looking back, and when she caught me doing the same, she wiped rain from her eyes and said, "We're not staying down there, right? We're committing to this?" "No," I answered. "The cottage is too easy to find. The hill is harder and harder is safer." The last stretch turned rocky and the mud finally thinned out, replaced by wet gray stone under the dim light. The cabin was tucked into a sharp bend in the ridge where the trees grew thick, and you literally couldn't see it until you were close enough to touch the rough-hewn logs. From 10 feet away, it just looked like part of the slope. Dark wood, a low roof buried under a foot of soil and leaf litter, with moss already claiming the edges. Linnea stopped, breathing hard, steam rising from her shoulders. "It looks like the hill, not a cabin," she said, and that was exactly the point. The padlock was still rusted shut on the hasp. Key turned. Metal clicked. The door groaned open into cold, dry air that smelled like pine sawdust and unfinished work. Inside, it was still bare bones. The small platform bed we'd built for weekends, a narrow work table, 2 folding chairs, and plywood sheets over packed earth for a floor. No shelves, no installed heat, and no comfort beyond what we carried in. A fast sweep came first, not paranoia, just basic safety. The dust on the table was undisturbed. There were no fresh, muddy footprints near the threshold, no candy wrappers, no cigarette ash, no new cuts in the woodpile outside. Linnea ran her fingers along the cold bed frame and said, "We can sleep, but we can't sleep cold. Not with wet gear." She looked toward the roofline and added, "We need heat tonight or we're going to be in trouble." The cast iron stove kit I'd hauled up here on a sled last winter was still sitting in the corner, boxed up because I kept putting the installation off for next weekend. I cut the straps and pulled the parts out onto the floor, Firebox, legs, pipe sections, and the metal collar meant to seal the roof opening. A flat stone base went down first so the heat wouldn't cook the plywood. We set the heavy stove near the front wall, safe distance from the bed and away from where we'd hang clothes. The pipe ran up through the pre-cut hole I'd plugged with insulation, and I screwed the collar down tight. Linnea held the pipe steady while I tightened the hardware, her hands black with soot from the factory coating. "Keep the profile low," she said. "We don't need a tall chimney advertising us to the valley." "Low but drafting," I answered, securing the cap. "Smoke needs to leave clean so it dissipates in the trees." Outside, the pipe rose just high enough to pull air, capped to block the rain. Water was the next logistical problem. A natural seep ran uphill from the cabin, a trickle that turned into a decent stream in this weather. It was good news because it was close, but bad news because water on a slope always tries to find your doorway. I grabbed a trenching tool and scraped a shallow channel along the uphill side to guide the runoff around the cabin's foundation. We filled it with rocks and gravel so it wouldn't silt up. Linnea watched the water divert into the new path and nodded. Inside, our clothes were soaked through. She stood near the bed, shivering, and said, "If we stay wet, we get sick, and we don't have antibiotics." She wasn't being dramatic. Damp fabric pulls heat out of the body fast. A 550-cord drying line went up under the roof beams, and we hung our wet layers where the rising heat would hit them. Boots stayed open, laces loose so moisture could escape without shrinking the leather. Light discipline started immediately. No lanterns near the windows, no headlamps pointed at the open door. When Linnea asked, "Do we seal the drafts?" I answered, "Yes, but nothing near the stove. We need oxygen." Heavy plastic sheeting went over the worst seams, stapled high, and a thick wool blanket got hung as a partition to keep the sleeping area warmer. A small hygiene corner came next. Sanitation kills you as fast as exposure if you ignore it. A water jug with a spout sat on a crate with soap and a towel on a hook. Linnea set it up, then looked at me and said, "This is a rule now. We wash hands before we touch food or faces." "Good," I said. "Rules keep us alive." When the first fire finally caught, it burned hot and clean, and the cabin temperature climbed just enough to take the bite out of the air. Rain kept tapping the roof in a steady, rhythmic pattern, covering the sound of our movement. Linnea sat on the edge of the bed with a mug of hot water, staring at the barred door. "We got here early," she said softly. "But we won't be the only ones who run to the woods." That thought hung in the warm air because tomorrow meant another trip down the mountain to the cottage for the food supplies, and down there was where the strangers would be. The rain dictated our entire schedule. If the cabin stayed damp, black mold would colonize the walls within days, and if our clothes stayed wet, the cold would sap our energy even with the stove running. The next morning started with a structural check, a hand run along the inside logs to feel for moisture, and a slow walk around the floor near the door. There were no puddles yet, but the packed earth under the plywood felt spongy at the edges. That meant runoff was sneaking under the foundation, which is what water always does on a slope. The uphill side got priority because gravity doesn't negotiate. I went out with the folding shovel and dug a diversion trench about a blade width deep, running it along the back wall and angling it sharply away so it could carry water downhill instead of letting it pool behind the logs. We filled the channel with rocks and gravel to prevent erosion, then laid down thick plastic sheeting, covering it all with leaf litter and mud so it looked like the natural forest floor. Linnea watched the first stream of brown water hit the new channel and divert safely away from our walls. "If that holds," she said, wiping mist from her face, "we don't wake up to a river running through the bedroom." Next was the entry. We needed an airlock. I pulled a rusted sheet of corrugated metal I'd stashed under the floor joists during the original build and rigged up a short porch roof. I set it on 2 posts so the rain couldn't drive directly onto the threshold. An inner door followed, a simple framed panel with heavy weather stripping. It created a small vestibule, meaning we could open the outer door, scan the woods, and close it again without dumping all our precious heat into the cold night. The main door got fortified. I drove 3-inch deck screws into the studs, not just the trim, and installed brackets for a heavy timber drop bar on the inside. A lock picks or breaks. A solid bar has to be destroyed. Linnea tested the bar, shoving against it with her shoulder, and said, "That's solid." "Solid is what buys us sleep," I answered. The windows were liabilities, what security guys call fatal funnels, so they became controlled openings. I screwed thick boards across the front window from the inside, leaving only a narrow horizontal slit at eye level that could be draped with blackout cloth. The side window got the same treatment. The goal wasn't to make the cabin bulletproof, it was to make entry slow, loud, and difficult, and to ensure absolutely zero light leaked out at night. Heat remained the center of our universe. The stove burned clean, but only if it had dry fuel and the forest was soaked. Standing deadwood became the target, trees with peeling bark and branches that snapped clean instead of bending. We processed the wood with a handsaw rather than an axe. The rhythmic shh, shh of a saw doesn't carry through the valley like the sharp crack of a chopping block. Splitting happened behind the cabin where the slope masked the movement. Linnea stacked the small, processed pieces under the new porch roof and said, "Small and dry means hot and fast." She glanced up at the chimney. "And clean smoke." Smoke was the giveaway we couldn't afford. The fire stayed hot and was fed often with small kindling to ensure complete combustion. The damper stayed open enough to prevent smoldering because white smoke is a signal flare. When the wind dropped and the air got heavy, we let the stove die down and relied on wool layers instead. Water was easy to find but hard to trust. The seep uphill ran clear, but clear water carries Giardia and Crypto just fine. A strict routine started and stayed the same. Collect in a pot, strain through cloth to remove sediment, then boil until it rolled for a full minute. When it cooled, it went into one jug marked with blue tape that said potable, and another jug stayed for washing. Linnea smoothed the tape down and said, "No guessing when we're tired. One mistake puts us down." Above the seep, I scraped a shallow groove to steer muddy runoff away so the source stayed usable. Power remained minimal on purpose. A battery bank and a crank radio lived on a high shelf, and the folding solar panel only came out for short windows when the clouds broke. I set the panel low behind brush so it wouldn't catch a reflection, then folded and hid it the second charging finished. Linnea watched the slope while it ran and said, "If anyone is looking from below, one sun flash off that glass is enough to give us up." Inside, supplies had to be squared away. Cans in one crate, dry goods in another, and a grab shelf with 2 ready-to-eat meals so stress wouldn't turn into frantic rummaging. Medical supplies went high. The crossbow hung near the inner door with bolts in a closed tube, protected from humidity. The shotgun stayed under the bed in cruiser-ready condition, chamber empty, tube full, and the handgun stayed locked unless we were outside. Then came the camouflage. The roof already had soil and leaves, but fresh construction work stands out. We brushed everything back into place, scattering fresh litter from uphill and pressing it down to match the slope. The chimney pipe was the hardest geometrical shape to hide, so I built a loose cage around it with chicken wire and wove in pine boughs, spacing them far enough away to avoid a fire hazard but close enough to break up the silhouette. From below it looked like a snag of brush, not a metal tube. Sound control mattered just as much as sight. Drilling happened in short bursts timed with thunder or wind gusts. Nothing metal got dropped on stone. Linnea held hardware in her palm, handing me screws one by one, and said, "If it clinks, it carries." 2 simple perimeter alarms went in, fishing lines strung between low branches with empty tin cans containing pebbles tied to them. One crossed the approach trail, the other covered the porch steps. A hygiene block was non-negotiable. Inside, a wash station stayed by the inner door. Outside, a privacy screen went up downhill, scrap boards and a tarp concealing a bucket with a tight sealing lid. A scoop of wood ash sat beside it to cut the smell, and the burial spot for waste was farther down the slope, well away from the seep and our walking paths. Linnea stepped back, checked the layout, and said, "This is how we don't get sick for no reason." The rain helped cover our work, washing away the smell of fresh sawdust, but it also erased tracks, which meant we had zero intelligence on who had been near the trail. Before dark, I scratched a few rocks on the path in a specific pattern so any disturbance would stand out later. By late afternoon, the cabin felt less like a weekend project and more like a hardened shelter. Rain still tapped the roof, but inside was warm and dry. And from the outside, the place looked like an unremarkable patch of hillside again. Linnea sat at the table, hands cupping a warm mug, and said, "We can actually stay here. It works." The thought that followed hit us both at the same time. Staying here only works until someone decides this mountain is worth climbing, and tomorrow we had to go back down. Going back down to the cottage felt like a mistake the moment our boots hit the wet trail. The mountain shelter was finally warm, sealed, and beginning to dry out, and leaving it meant exposing our position again. But the math didn't care about our feelings. We still needed the heavy hardware, the extra tarps, and far more calories than 2 packs could carry in a single run. The rain remained steady, a gray curtain that helped mask the sound of our movement, but it turned every exposed root into a grease-slicked trap waiting to snap an ankle. Linnea tightened her hood against the wind and said, "We grab what we need, we load up, and we don't linger. Smash and grab rules." We tied the safety rope between our belts again, loose enough to walk without tangling, tight enough to arrest a slide. Our packs were light on the descent, empty shells waiting for the weight of the return trip. Halfway down, the forest looked disturbed. A low hemlock branch had been snapped clean off, exposing white wood, and a fresh scrape marred a trunk at shoulder height. Linnea pointed at the damage and asked, "You think someone came up after us?" "Could be," I answered, scanning the brush. "Or someone came through here looking for a place to hide and moved on." The cottage came into view through the rain and thin fog, and the mud at the threshold told the real story. New boot prints, wider than Linnea's and not as deep as my own, were stamped into the soft earth, angling toward the porch and then looping back toward the road. Someone had definitely stopped here after we left. There were no voices, no banging, just the drumming of rain on the metal roof and a faint rhythmic creak coming from inside. Linnea stayed a step behind me, hand near her belt, and said, "If this goes bad, we back out instantly. We don't argue, we just run." "Agreed," I whispered, keeping my footing off the noisy centerboards of the porch. I slid the key in. The lock turned. The door opened into stale, slightly warmer air that felt occupied. A kitchen chair had been dragged into the hallway, positioned right under the ceiling access, and one cabinet door hung open. Linnea looked at the chair, then her eyes snapped to the ceiling hatch. A small sound came from above, fabric shifting against insulation. Then a man's voice, muffled by the drywall, drifted down. "Please don't shoot, I'm not sick." It wasn't a brave voice, it was exhausted. "Come down," I called out, keeping my distance from the ladder zone. "Hands empty and do it slow." The attic boards groaned and a head appeared at the hatch opening. He was soaked through, mud caked on his jeans, gray stubble on his jaw, and his eyes kept flicking between us like a trapped animal. Both palms came up first, showing empty skin. Then he eased down the ladder like he expected a single mistake to end him. Boots hit the floor with a thud. He backed against the wall, putting distance between us, and said, "Wade Holland, I work the farm 2 bends down the county road." He swallowed hard. "I know this isn't my place, but my house isn't safe anymore." Linnea stepped forward, keeping the hallway clear, and asked, "How did you get in, Wade?" The door was locked. Wade wiped sweat and rain off his brow and said, "I shimmied the pantry window around back. I helped you patch this roof last summer, remember? I knew that window latch has been busted for a year." He took a shaky breath and continued, "My house sits right on the main road. People started stopping there before noon, banging on doors, demanding gas and food. Then I watched one of those sick ones tumble out of a truck bed and bite a neighbor right by my mailbox. Nobody knew what to do except scream." He looked at his hands. "I ran, and I didn't come here to steal. I figured you city folk wouldn't make it out this far and this place would be empty." He hesitated, eyes darting to the door. "I heard your truck earlier. I heard you leave, so I stayed quiet up top." Fear makes people lie cleanly, but his story tracked. "Anyone with you?" I asked. Wade shook his head violently. "Alone. I'm not leading anyone to you." Linnea watched his body language and asked, "Do you have anything to contribute?" Wade nodded toward the open hatch. "Food, dry stuff, beans, rice, flour, a big jar of honey. I grabbed a hunting pack when I ran." The offer landed heavy. Wade knew calories were currency and he was spending them to buy safety. Linnea glanced at me and Wade pushed, his voice urgent but controlled. "I'll trade. Take the food. Just let me come with you. If you leave me here, the next group that finds this cottage finds me, and they might not be neighbors." Linnea said, "You understand we're not running a public shelter. We have limited space." Wade nodded fast. "I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you not to leave me on the road to die." Rain covered the silence while the decision formed. He was a local, he was able-bodied, and he had supplies. "One rule," I said. "You follow our pace, you keep your mouth shut, and you don't touch anything you didn't bring." Wade answered, "Done," then added, "And I can carry weight. I can help you hump that gear up the hill." He climbed back up, slid down 2 overstuffed burlap sacks and a small cooler, then descended with a heavy hunting pack on his shoulders. Linnea stepped in close. "Hold still," she said. She checked his forearms and neck for obvious wounds or bites. He flinched slightly when she checked his left arm but pulled away before she got a good look, saying, "I'm clean, just scraped up from the woods." She looked at him hard, then said, "If you're hiding anything, Wade, it ends badly for you." He met her eyes, barely, and answered, "I'm not hiding anything, I just want out." We stripped the cottage fast. The hardware bin, the propane canisters, the extra plastic sheeting, and the last of the dry firewood under the eaves. Then all 3 of us stepped back into the relentless rain. The packs were brutally heavy now, but Wade took the brunt of the extra load without complaint. The trail felt narrower on the way up, the presence of a stranger changing the dynamic. Wade breathed hard behind us, sweat mixing with rain on his face, but he kept up. When Linnea glanced back and whispered, "No talking unless you have to," he just nodded and kept his eyes glued to the muddy ground. Near the top, an engine roared down on the road, then cut out abruptly. We froze, listening. No lights cut the dark, no doors slammed, just the wind in the needles. But it was a reminder that the slope could get crowded fast and we weren't the only ones looking for a place to hide. Back inside the cabin, the heavy inner door shut and the timber bar dropped into its steel brackets with a final thud. The warm air hit us, smelling of wood smoke and damp wool drying overhead, and for a split second it felt like the hill had swallowed us back into safety. Wade dropped his sacks by the table and said, "That's everything I grabbed. I didn't touch anything from your cabinets, I swear." Linnea nodded once, sharp and efficient, but her eyes never left him. The rules started immediately. Hands got scrubbed at the jug and soap station by the door, and packs stayed closed until we decided where the inventory would live. Wade stood still while Linnea checked his wrists and sleeves again, more thoroughly this time. He held his palms out and said, "I told you I'm clean." But the words came out a little too fast, a little too rehearsed. We set up a spot for him on a spare cot built from scrap boards and a folded moving pad, positioning it right near the door where he could be watched from the table. Linnea pointed a finger at the cot and said, "That's your zone. You don't cross the line by the bed and you don't touch the tools." Wade answered, "Understood," and collapsed onto the cot like his legs had simply quit on him. The first hour passed in a tight, uncomfortable silence. He ate slowly, nursing a small bowl of rice and beans, keeping his voice low and deferential when he spoke. But then the little things, the tells, started showing up. Sweat was beading on his forehead even though the cabin wasn't particularly hot. His fingers kept worrying at his left sleeve, tugging the cuff down like he couldn't stop touching it. When Linnea asked from across the room, "You cold, Wade?" he jumped and answered, "No, just tired." Adrenaline crash, probably, and pulled the cuff down again. Dusk came early under the heavy storm clouds. I fed the stove, covered the viewing slit with the blackout cloth, and we moved quietly, sticking to the discipline we'd been practicing. Wade watched all of it with wide, glassy eyes, then asked, "How long you two been up here?" The question landed wrong. It didn't sound like curiosity. It sounded like he was measuring our resources. Linnea kept her voice even, cutting through the noise of the rain, and said, "Why do you keep hiding your arm?" Wade blinked, flushed, and answered, "I told you I banged it on a branch coming down. It's just a bruise." A minute later, he stood up too fast and swayed dangerously. His hand slapped the table for balance. "Sit down," I ordered, and he dropped back onto the cot, but his breathing stayed shallow and rapid. Linnea stepped into his space without touching him and said, "Wade, show me your arm. Now." He hesitated, eyes darting around the room, then shook his head. "It's nothing," he stammered. "Just a scrape." The hesitation was the answer. Linnea held her hands out, palms open but demanding. "If it's nothing, you show it, and this gets easier for everyone. If you don't, we assume the worst." Wade's eyes flicked to the barred door, then down to his sleeve. "I didn't want to scare you," he whispered, his voice cracking. I thought I could sweat it out." The sleeve came up slow. The bite marks sat on the inside of his forearm, 2 rows of half-moon punctures with ugly dark purple bruising radiating around them. The skin looked hot and angry. Linnea stepped back instantly. Wade lifted his other hand like he could calm the situation and said, "It happened earlier, down by the road. But look, I'm still talking, I feel fine." He tried to smile, but it was a grimace. "Maybe it doesn't always turn you," he pleaded. "Maybe I'm lucky." The thought ran through my head instantly. The guy at the hospital turned in minutes. Wade had been walking for hours. Maybe adrenaline slowed it down, or maybe the neck bite at the hospital just hit the bloodstream faster. It didn't matter. The risk was absolute. Linnea's voice went hard as granite. "You lied to us." Wade looked at the marks and said, "I didn't know for sure. I hoped it would pass." I reached under the bed and pulled out the shotgun. The pump action slide racked with a sound that filled the small room, and I kept the muzzle low, pointed at the floorboards in front of Wade's feet. "Stand up," I said. He stood, shaking violently now, hands half raised in surrender. Linnea stared him down and said, "You should have told us at the cottage. We gave you a chance." Wade's shoulders sagged under the weight of it. "You would have left me there," he whispered. "You're leaving now," I said. "Right now." Wade took a step toward the door like he couldn't process the command. "Out there is death," he said. "In here is worse," Linnea answered. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't bend either. I lifted the timber bar. The inner door swung open and the cold, wet air pushed in. Wade looked past us into the dark trees and the relentless rain. "Just give me time," he begged. "Let me stay until..." The shotgun barrel stayed between us like a fence. "Go," I said. "Walk down the trail. Do not turn back." He stumbled out onto the porch, his boots slipping on the wet boards. At the steps, he turned back one last time, eyes wide and desperate in the gloom. "You're making a mistake," he rasped. Linnea didn't argue. She just watched him and said, "Keep moving." Wade backed away into the brush, hesitated, and then disappeared down the slope, swallowed by the rain and the pines. The door shut. The bar dropped. Linnea immediately grabbed the bleach jug, poured a heavy splash into hot water, and started scrubbing the table, the cot frame, and the floor spot where Wade had stood. His sleeve had left a damp smear on the wood, and neither of us wanted to guess what biology was in it. The wet rags went into a trash bag and straight out onto the porch to be burned later. Then I checked the trail alarm and reset the door cans because fear makes you skip steps at night. Linnea leaned against the wall, smelling of bleach, and whispered, "Never again." I nodded before the words even left my mouth. No more strangers, no more deals. The mountain shelter stayed ours, or it stayed empty. After Wade disappeared down the slope, the cabin didn't just feel smaller, it felt compromised. The walls hadn't moved, but the trust had evaporated. The rain kept coming, the stove kept ticking as the metal expanded, and every sound from the wet woods carried the same heavy question. What if he turns and comes back? We established a clean zone protocol immediately. I laid a strip of duct tape across the floorboards 3 feet from the bed. Anything past that line had to be sanitized. Boots came off strictly on the porch under the overhang. Wet outer layers stayed on hooks near the door until they were dry enough to bring inside. Linnea refilled the wash jug, set the soap and hand sanitizer beside it, and said, "Hands every time, no exceptions." She looked me dead in the eye and added, "Even when we're tired, especially when we're tired." I nodded because getting sick from a dirty handshake would be the stupidest way to lose this game. Wade's sacks became part of our inventory, but we treated them like hazardous materials. The beans, rice, flour, and the 50-pound sack of deer corn were valuable, but the packaging was suspect. The cooler held smoked meat wrapped tight in butcher paper. Linnea wiped every single package down with a bleach solution and said, "We keep the calories, but we don't keep his germs." The table got scrubbed raw before any of those crates were stowed away. Water management remained steady. The uphill seep was running hard because the ground was saturated, so a covered bucket lived there behind a rock to catch the flow. When it filled, we hauled it in, strained it through tight weave cloth, and boiled it rolling. One jug was marked, "Drink in blue tape," the other "Wash." Linnea tapped the labels and said, "No guessing in low light," then tightened the lids. Heat was the hardest part of the equation in constant rain because dry wood is always further away than you want it to be. Standing dead trees were still the answer, but they had to be felled, bucked, and split, then covered instantly. I rigged a tarp steeper over the wood stack so water ran off fast. The stove burned hot in short cycles and the door stayed latched tight because a smoky fire is a signal flare to the valley. When the wind dropped and the smoke wanted to hang low in the trees, we let the fire die and leaned on wool layers instead. Power stayed minimal. The radio came on briefly at dawn and again before dark, then went back to the shelf. Most stations were static or broadcasting looped warnings telling people to report to public shelters, which sounded like death traps to me. Linnea listened to the weather report more than the news and said, 3 more days of rain. Like it was a deployment schedule we had to respect. Security turned into a rigid routine. The timber bar stayed in the brackets. The trip lines got checked morning and night. I dragged heavy brush across the lower part of the trail so the approach looked like storm damage rather than a path. Mud was our friend because any new prints would show immediately. Hunting started because it made sense, not for sport. The crossbow came out at first light when the rain softened to a drizzle. The goal was small game that stayed close, squirrels and rabbits feeding along the edge of the timber. Linnea stayed inside watching the slit while I moved slow and low, keeping my profile below the rhododendrons. I took a clean shot on a rabbit near a stump, but I didn't field dress it there. I bagged it in plastic so no blood dripped on the trail to lead predators, or worse, to our door. Back at the cabin, the meat went into a lidded pot with salt and rice so the smell stayed trapped. We buried the guts far downhill under heavy rocks. The hygiene block stayed strict. The waste bucket sat downhill with a scoop of ash after every use. A small soak pit for gray water sat farther down, lined with river stones so it didn't turn into a slick mud pit on the main path. Linnea checked it after a hard downpour and said, "If that floods, we're walking through filth." So I cut a shallow relief channel to steer the runoff away. The first real test of our perimeter came 2 nights after Wade left. The tin cans on the lower trip line rattled once, sharp and metallic, then went still. I turned the stove damper down immediately, plunging the cabin into shadow. Linnea leaned close and whispered, "Don't talk." She settled behind the table, the shotgun held ready but low. A slow, rhythmic shuffle came from the trail, followed by a wet, dragging sound like boots refusing to lift out of the mud. Through the viewing slit, a shape leaned into the brush line and stopped, head forward, shoulders slack. Then 2 more shapes drifted out of the gloom behind it, all moving with the same disjointed, soaking wet sluggishness. The lead figure stepped into the thin ambient light, and the face turned enough for me to recognize the tragedy. Wade Holland's jaw hung loose, unhinged, his skin gray in the rain, mouth working like he was chewing thick air. Linnea's hand went to her mouth, but she didn't make a sound. Silence was the only armor we had left. Wade hadn't made it to the road. The infection must have dropped him in the brush just a few hundred yards down, and he'd been wandering in circles until a noise drew him back. Wade's body pushed through the brush barrier, caught on a branch, and just kept pressing until the wood snapped. Wet hands pawed at the outer door. Nails scraped against the wood. The timber bar held. The inner door held. Minutes dragged like hours. Then the wind shifted, or maybe a tree creaked downhill. Wade's head snapped around. The others turned with him. Stragglers he must have picked up in the woods. A low moan drifted away down the slope, and all 3 bodies followed it, slow and automatic, back into the brush until the forest swallowed them. Only then did Linnea breathe out. "That's why we don't let people in," she whispered. "Yeah," I answered, staring at the door. "And that's why we don't go looking for him." Morning brought fresh mud on the porch, but the trail looked empty again. The shelter stayed quiet, the work stayed boring, and the mountain kept us hidden, as long as we acted like it was watching us back. The weeks didn't pass, they just blurred into a single gray loop of rain on the roof, steam rising from drying wool, and the relentless maintenance that keeps a shelter from rotting. The cabin never felt comfortable. It was too tight, too damp, but it felt predictable, and predictability is the only luxury we could afford while the world down below kept changing without permission. Food stayed simple. Rice, beans, oats, and whatever small game the Crossbow could harvest without sending a gunshot echoing through the valley. Linnea ran the pantry crate like a drill sergeant. "If it isn't on the list, it doesn't get opened," she said. And that hard rule saved us from stress eating our supplies when the nights dragged on too long. Water remained a strict discipline: carry, strain, boil, label, and store. We let the mountain do most of the hiding for us, but habits did the rest. No lights after dark unless the blackout shutters were sealed tight. No fires that pushed thick smoke. No trash left where a scavenger could drag it into view. We brushed away our tracks when the rain eased, and we fixed the brush cover when the wind flattened it. Some mornings the radio offered nothing but dead air and static. Other mornings it carried clipped, calm voices reading government-approved scripts about checkpoints, shelter sites, and neighborhoods being under control, though none of it sounded like control to me. Linnea would listen for a minute, then look at the stove and say, "We don't need a plan for the city today." She was right. The only plan that mattered was making it to the next sunrise without being noticed. Trust never came back after Wade. It stayed dead. If someone called out from the trees, the door stayed barred. If footsteps came close, we went silent and let the mountain do its job. That choice didn't feel heroic. It felt necessary. The small bed we'd built for weekend getaways turned into the one normal thing we protected. At night, when the stove was banked low and the rain softened to a drizzle, Linnea would rest her head on my shoulder and say, "Promise me we won't get careless." The answer stayed the same every time. We won't. Spring would change everything if we made it there. If the rain stopped and the ground dried, the dead and the living would start moving faster. Maybe the outbreak would burn itself out in pockets, maybe it wouldn't. Either way, the shelter had to hold through the season that comes before answers. The work isn't dramatic like in the movies. It's tightening screws that swell loose in wet wood, wiping condensation off the logs to fight mold, and checking the drain trench after every downpour so it doesn't backflow into the living space. It's keeping the crossbow string waxed, the shotgun action oiled, and the batteries dry, because tools fail when you ignore them. It's talking each other through the fear instead of letting it turn into bad decisions. For now, this cabin is our entire universe. It's logs, earth, and a hot stove with a hygiene corner that keeps sickness out, and a narrow slit in a boarded window that lets us watch without being seen. We stay off the radar by doing the boring things every single day, quietly, carefully, and without taking chances that look exciting on screen. My name is Caspian Rook, and this place was supposed to be a private project I finished on weekends. Now it's the only reason Linnea and I are still here, dry, warm, and alive, while the rain keeps falling and the forest keeps its secrets. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.